Welcome to Annapolis Mosaics. Our program spotlights people in our community who are involved in activities designed to promote good human relations. I am Michael Keller, the chair of the Annapolis Human Relations Commission and your host. The commission is a city board that seeks to promote equal opportunity and to eliminate discrimination. My guest today is Carl Snowden, who is the convener of the Caucus of African American Leaders. Carl, welcome to Annapolis Mosaics.
Thank you, Mike.
Well, relations between law enforcement officers and minority communities have reached a real flashpoint in our nation with the killings of several unarmed African Americans and the release of reports such as the one that was recently presented from Baltimore City that show that there is a history of bias and ill treatment of African Americans within police departments. With that in context, and we're talking there, of course, about a national phenomenon which has been going on for some time and is now only coming to the public's true attention.
Right.
How would you assess the status of the relations between communities of color in Annapolis and Anne Arundel County and their respective police departments?
Well, first, again, thank you, Mike, for the invitation to be on the program. The report you referred to is United States Department of Justice report, in which they spent a year analyzing police community relations in Baltimore City. And what they concluded was that the relationship that existed, the African Americans in that city were often arrested, detained illegally, and stopped, that their constitutional rights, their civil liberties had been abridged. Probably the most damaging part of that particular investigation was that they found that there was a culture that existed in the city of Baltimore, and that police officers had systemically violated the constitutional rights of people. Now, how does that apply to the city of Annapolis? That's Baltimore City. It's 30 miles away, approximately. Well, here's how it affected the city of Annapolis. Unbeknownst to most of the listening audience and viewing audience, 20% of the city's police force here in Annapolis came from Baltimore City. So if you have a custom, if you have a culture that existed in Baltimore City and you bring down a number of people from Baltimore City, I suppose that that culture comes with it. Here in the city of Annapolis, we've not had Freddie Gray's situation where someone has been shot at this point by a police officer. But there have been many, many complaints about how African Americans feel they're being treated by police officers in the city of Annapolis. We had a public hearing, as you recall, last year where there was a forum that the Caucus of African Americans sponsored, and we had citizens who testified that they were often called names by police officers and treated rather badly.
There have been a number of ideas that have been expressed on how to promote justice and equity in law enforcement. And I'd like to sort of explore some of them with you in specific, and especially from the perspective of police community relations in Annapolis and Anne Arundel County. The first subject I'd like to touch upon is what's been called as the broken windows approach. It was brought about by an individual who served twice as commissioner of the police in the city of New York. Again, the concept is that police departments ought to give priority to enforcing low-level offenses and minor drug-related crimes because this will have a trickle-down effect on the larger criminal activity. But there have been those who have said that just a reverse should be done, that the police department should really reduce the priority that they place on enforcing these lower level, often drug-related offenses, so that they can focus their time on more important matters. What's your thoughts about that?
Well, the approach you're talking about was implemented a number of years ago under the former mayor of New York City, and it came under tremendous criticism because what it meant was that whatever laws were being violated, was jaywalking, spitting on the sidewalk, loitering, the police officers would enforce it. If there's someone jaywalking and they implement this particular philosophy, they alone have the right to determine whether you arrest that person or stop that person for jaywalking. What has been missing out of the criminal justice system is justice. And we would find that we would have a much better system if the perception was that if you're an African American or Latino, you're going to be treated just like any other citizen. The vast majority of people of color don't believe that. How many times have you heard or read where someone is stopped for a traffic violation that winds up being fatally shot who happened to be white? It's all unheard of. But with African Americans, Latinos, it happened all too frequently.
Another idea which has gotten a lot of attention is proposals that there be the creation of an external board or commission or its equivalent that would have the responsibility for identifying issues related to police operations, as well as looking at serious incidents in which there has been use of force and being able to examine those from an independent perspective. Your thoughts about that?
Well, I think that's what you need to restore trust. I think most people would find it incredulous that we allow the police to investigate the police when there is an alleged wrongdoing by a police officer. It's actually his colleagues, his peers, members of his force that investigate that situation. And I think people don't have confidence that police should be investigating themselves. So to have a outside and external group looking at what the facts are and making a judgment, I think would restore confidence in the system. We call it a Community Civilian Review Board, where people would be able to serve on this board, would be able to look at whatever the allegations are and make a determination. Here in Maryland, because we have the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights, it's very, very difficult to create the kind of board I just described. But there are a number of people working very diligently to change the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights that would allow this kind of panel to exist.
Another suggestion that has been made is that there be rigorous data collection by police departments on stops, on arrests, on uses of force, and that that information be placed online where all citizens can view it. Do you think that would be helpful?
It would be helpful with the one proviso, who's collecting and who's interpreting. Because again, the system is largely based on whether you trust the information that's being given. And if it's the police department that's analyzing the information, gathering the data, you're again asking that department to reveal how it operates. And most institutions, quite honestly, will not do the kind of transparency on themselves. It usually takes outside forces to make that happen.
And another suggestion which has come to be adopted at several police departments has been the earmarking of funds for and requiring the use of body cameras and related devices by police officers, so that if there are incidents, you've got a video recording of it. Do you think this is a good idea?
I think it's a good idea. It's not a panacea, but it certainly is a good idea. One of the things that we're doing in conjunction with the ACLU, because again, you cannot just depend on the police department, because again, the police officer activates the camera, the body camera. He or she can turn it on and turn it off at will. What we're doing is working with the American Civil Liberties Union to have citizens be trained on how to videotape interactions between police and community. Many of the most egregious cases that's come to the public attention didn't come because the police were wearing body cameras. It came because citizens were on patrol, saw a police officer engaged in some activity that they thought was wrong, and videotaped it. There are 3 or 4 cases that is in the public domain that had it not been for citizens, we would have never known what happened. It would just been that officer's version of what occurred. So in general, we support body cameras, but I think it's important that citizens remember that they too have the right to record what's going on, and often their eyewitness account is more credible.
Police training has also come under scrutiny, and there have been recommendations made that police departments sponsor training that specifically emphasize the de-escalation facet of law enforcement. What do you think about that?
Absolutely necessary. In fact, just recently, and very sad and unfortunate, a police officer stopped a man for a traffic violation. The man attempted to talk to the officer, and he was shot and killed. And what it later turned out was that the person who was shot and killed was deaf. The police officer thought he was not obeying a lawful command of stopping, and the guy was trying to explain, using sign language, that he couldn't hear. And he mistook that to be that the guy was disobeying a lawful order. He shot and killed him. So the idea of creating a program that de-escalates is not only necessary, but there are all kinds of constituency groups where it would be very, very helpful.
And there's one other idea which I'd like to share with you, and that's what's been described in the broad category of community policing, very specifically training the police on how to develop better relations with the communities in which they're working, focusing on things such as culture, diversity, mental illness, youth, bias, racism. In other words, that police officers just aren't a highway patrol that come through a community, ride by, and people never see them, but that there be individuals who are trained to understand the nature of the community, the history of the community, and that they take on somewhat of a role of a sociologist in that sense, but that they be given specific training to understand the communities in which with which they're working, rather than simply in the regard of law enforcement. This has become popular in a lot of police departments, but there's some controversy with it. What's your thoughts about it?
Well, the Department of Justice has done an absolutely great job of looking at what it takes to improve police and community relations. And one of the things that have worked and worked effectively well is when you get members of the police department that reflects the community that it serves. When you have a situation as they did in Ferguson, where you had a police department, where you had a city rather, that was 80% African American, but the police force had less than 2 African Americans on it, it was so out of balance that it created the problem it created. So if we could have a police department that reflected the community that it served, had the diversity of that community, it would help to address some of the particular issues, because you're not training people just on how to understand and deal with other people. You're dealing with, you'll have a police department that is diverse and reflect the community in which it serves. In a Latino community where people can only speak Spanish, it would be very, very helpful to have a Latino police officer who understood both English and Spanish as he's communicating to citizens who speak Spanish only. And the same thing with African Americans. In fact, one of the really, I think, effective operations has been Washington, D.C., believe it or not. In Washington, D.C., they take diversity not only in race and color, but sexual orientation. So there are police officers who deal with the gay and lesbian community who themselves are gay and lesbian. And what they've found is that that community feels much more comfortable dealing with people who understand their needs.
We're going to take a break now, but when we return, I will be chatting with Carl Snowden on the recommendations that have been made by the caucus of African American leaders, as well as some more broader issues related to race relations in our society. I'm talking today with Carl Snowden, who is the convener of the Caucus of African American Leaders. Carl, the caucus has made a number of recommendations to City Council as it relates to police-community relations. What is the status of these recommendations?
Right, and Mike, for your listening audience and viewing audience, I just want to give a little brief history of what the caucus is.
All right.
The caucus is a consortium of African American organizations throughout the county. So we have representatives from the NAACP, we have elected officials who are part of the caucus, we have clergy members. It's designed to have a broad spectrum of the African American community. We meet on a monthly basis to look at issues that impact on the community. One of those issues that, of course, was impacting on the community was police and its relationship to African Americans. So we met, we held a public hearing, we gathered recommendations from the public as it relates to what we thought as a community could be done to improve police-community relations. One of the things that we strongly recommended was that they have an African American liaison as well as a Latino liaison to work in these particular communities. And as you may have heard, the mayor has finally appointed someone to serve as the African American liaison. It happens to be Larry Griffin. Larry Griffin is well respected in the African American community. We're delighted that he got that appointment. He has a lot of work to do, obviously, but that was one of the recommendations that came out. The other was body cameras. There's now a pilot program that's in place now, where for the next few months they're going to see if this body camera works for the city of Annapolis. That's in place. And the third recommendation that we made, or one of the other recommendations, was this Community Civilian Review Board that we talked about earlier. Nothing's been done on that at all. There were other recommendations that dealt with looking at the police department's general orders in terms of what could be done to improve those. We gave Chief Priesthoop a number of recommendations to deal with improving police-community relations. What the public probably do not know, and it's probably a good point, good opportunity to point this out, because it's their tax dollars. Our city police chief is the highest paid official in the city, making $153,000. He makes more than the mayor, he makes more than the city attorney, he makes even more than Tom Andrews, who's the city manager. Now, presumably the reason he makes so much is because the expectation is so great. Being the chief of police is a major responsibility. So we expect as taxpayers that people we pay these wonderful salaries to will be able to deliver. And so in about a year, as we come up to October, last October we held our conference on the mayor, on the police chief in the police department. A year later, October, later in this year, we're going to reconvene and look at how far we've come since making those improvements or recommendations.
Looking at the issue of race relations nationally, they've gotten a lot of attention in the last several years. There was a view after the election and then re-election of President Obama that we've entered a post-racial era. I think back, I can remember similar sentiments expressed after the collapse of Jim Crow during the 1970s and 1980s. And of course, what we know is that that there is a long, long way that still needs to be addressed in terms of steps. But I think that average people would want to think about how they can individually assist with this in their lives. And they can follow the news and the like. But I can see a lot of people saying, well, what can I do? So that's my question. What can ordinary citizens do to improve and further good race relations in our society? And when we talk about race relations, we're talking about all races. We're talking about whites vis-a-vis African Americans, whites vis-a-vis Latinos, African Americans vis-a-vis Latinos, and then also the interface with Asian Americans who have been the source of discrimination in some areas. So again, the question is, what can the average person on the street do about this? What would your advice be to them?
Two quick stories, and then to answer answer that question directly. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1963, for the first time, met a man named Bull Connor, who was the Commissioner of Public Safety, et cetera. That particular Birmingham, Alabama, was considered a very, very racist city. And Dr. King had went to try to change the situation there. And he met face to face with Bull Connor. And Bull Connor told Dr. King, it's just a matter of mind over matter. We don't mind and you don't matter. And Dr. King said at that point he understood we had to change that equation. Mm-hmm. And you fast forward it to today, that same attitude exists, because Black Lives Matter, when people say it, people assume that meant that no other lives matter. Yeah. When in fact what the originators of that was trying to point out is that other lives have mattered. It's the fact that Black lives have not mattered. So I'm a big believer in education. Mm-hmm. And I think that people should take the time to read, to understand history. Take, for example, Annapolis, Maryland, which a lot of people don't know this, but Annapolis was the first in the state of Maryland to elect its first Black elected official. And that happened in 1873. That was 8 years after the Civil War. African Americans have served on the city council from 1873 to the present, with only one exception. In 1906, the Maryland General Assembly passed a law that said, it was called the grandfather law. It says if your grandfather couldn't vote, you couldn't vote. So from 1906 to 1915, there was no representation on the city council. It literally took the Republican Party of that day to sue the Maryland General Assembly, went all the way to the Supreme Court, and African Americans got their right their right to vote restored. Many Annapolitans have no idea of that history. Many Annapolitans living in the city of Annapolis, if you mention to them a man named Henry Davis, they have no idea who he was. Well, Henry Davis was the last African American to be lynched in the city of Annapolis. And that lynching took place in 1906. And he was lynched on the grounds of St. John's College, one of the oldest universities or colleges in the country. And when he was lynched, he did not, because of the weight of his body, the tree in which a chestnut tree in which he was placed on broke. And he had not quite died. So he was shot 100 times. His body was mutilated. And they created postcards, and those were sent around the country. When Annapolitans learn this part of their history, they will then understand why it's important to have dialogue, important to be able to understand that this is not something that happened in Mississippi, Louisiana, or places in the Deep South, but it actually happened here in Annapolis. And as you are well aware, on the State House grounds is a statue of Roger Taney. Roger Taney was the Chief Justice for Maryland, the Chief Justice for the Supreme Court who came from Maryland. We've only had 2 justices that ever served on the Supreme Court from Maryland. One was Roger Taney, and the other was, of course, Thurgood Marshall. And we think the more citizens know their history, the better it will be.
You know, I'm glad you made reference, Carl, to the Black Lives Matter movement. There has, of course, been a great deal of controversy about that particular name. We've had several congregations put up signs. Those signs were mutilated, I think, perhaps by the work of one person, I think, in most of those cases, but still the controversy remains. And I think there's been a lot of misunderstanding of it. When you talk about Black Lives Matter, you're absolutely right. You're not talking that it means that other lives don't matter. It means that for most of our history, and this goes to the example you gave, for most of our history, Black lives haven't mattered. They didn't certainly matter during the period of slavery. They didn't matter during the period of Jim Crow. Michelle Alexander, in her wonderful book, The New Jim Crow, points out that they're still not fully mattering because of the large incarceration of African American males. And you can argue that they don't matter as long as there is this tremendous socioeconomic gap in our society between whites and African Americans. So I think that, I'm glad you brought that up. I think it's a very, very important concept. Carl, you've been a leader, you have been perhaps the foremost leader in efforts to preserve the history of civil rights in Annapolis and Anne Arundel County. How do things stand now?
Well, I want to take also a moment, just Mike, to lift up the name of Alan Legum, who recently passed. Alan Legum was a local lawyer, because you had mentioned what people can do. And Alan Legum decided long ago that his contribution, he happened to be a lawyer, he could contribute his legal talents, and he did. And he helped us create 3 memorials here in Anne Arundel County. The first is the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial that exists at Anne Arundel Community College. Then we have the Coretta Scott King Memorial Garden that's in Edgewater. And finally, the Civil Rights Foot Soldiers Memorial. And what we did was, in building these memorials, we didn't look for government funding. We had the citizens of Annapolis and Anne Arundel County actually contribute to the building of these memorials. And they were built because it's important that the next generation remember the history of where we are, how we got where we are as a nation. And so these 3 memorials exist, along with the Kunta Kinte Memorial in downtown Annapolis. And one of the things we hope to be able to do in the very, very near future is to build another memorial, and that's going to be a memorial reflecting the contributions that women have made.
Carl, you recently took on a new activity in serving as a columnist for the Capitol, and I've noticed that in your columns, which I do read, that you've spent a good part of time highlighting the people in our community, such as Alan Legum, who have made a real contribution to civil rights. Are there other individuals who you've covered in your column that you would like to comment on?
Right. Well, you know, there have been a number of people in this city who have really done a marvelous job. You know, I'm a history buff, and so it will come to some as a surprise that we didn't elect the first African-American woman to be on the city council until 1997. That's relatively a short period of time. The first African-American, the first woman to be mayor was Ellen Moyer, who you mentioned. This program got started under her administration. So what we attempt to do is to relate local events that have made an impact on our general community in the column. One of the things that I'm going to be writing a column on is called No Snitching. You know, that's a concept that people have where police officers have frequently said that the problem with finding people commit crimes is that the community refuses to cooperate out of fear or other reasons. My argument is, and this is what the column will say, is that that's not the reason people do not share information. The reason I argue that they don't share information has to do with what the police do. There is this code of silence. You will find that if a police officer commits an infraction, a crime, Police officers don't snitch. They don't tell on each other. The Freddie Gray case, there are many, many police officers that saw what happened. Not one voluntarily came forward. And when you have that happening in law enforcement, the community begins to emulate the same behavior of the police department. So we believe, again, if we can get the police department to do what they advocate citizens do, if you see something, say something. When they see racism, when they see some infraction taking place among their own, if they would speak up forcefully, we believe that citizens would do the same thing. And that's a kind of different twist that you'll read in the column they would not necessarily read elsewhere.
Thank you for viewing our program today, and please join us again on Annapolis Mosaics. If you would like more information about the Annapolis Human Relations Commission, jot down the information on your screen. You can reach us at 410-263-7998 or by email at hrcommission@annapolis.gov. And check out our page at the City of Annapolis website. Go to www.annapolis.gov, click on City Government, then Boards and Commissions, and you can scroll down to the Human Relations Commission page. And always remember the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said, "We have flown the air like birds and swum the seas like fishes, but have yet to learn the simple act of walking the earth as brothers and sisters."